So now, I want to sing a song just for you. 'Cause you're my special friend.
Happy Halloween, real ones! I hope you've got on your most absorbent pair of underwear because it's a special spooky themed episode, and this time we are going to cover The Exorcism of Emily Rose. This movie is loosely based on the alleged demonic possession of a young German woman in the 1970s named Anneliese Michel and the attempted exorcisms that ultimately contributed to her death, as well as the court proceedings that followed in attempts to sort out what ultimately happened. When it comes to haunting and possession movies, there's always a certain inherent skepticism when attaching the inspired by true events label to them.
The power of Christ compels you!
Guess what? It's not that compelling.
But the story behind the actual events of this is pretty fascinating and still the cause for debate amongst many, even to this day, about what happened to this poor young lady. Was she a tragic victim of improper or undiagnosed illnesses, failed by the medical system and those around her, allowing her to spiral into madness and death? Or was she the victim of something else, even more dark and sinister, that no one could truly understand or save her from? The movie is creepy for sure and the performances are all wonderful, but is it accurate to what actually happened? Well, before you go trick for your treats,
I want to see some buttholes.
let's see if we can exorcise the truth. This is the real story behind the exorcism of Emily Rose. And if you'd like to give me a little treat, you should do all the things to all the buttons, as it helps out tremendously.
Think I want some dinkle, get it to me, huh? Come on, do it. Lay it on right here, do it. Do it.
And if you'd like to do the full-size candy bar level of supporting, we also have a Patreon. Money is the root of all evil after all, so feel free to give any of its filthiness to me because I am a lost cause already. No, for real, thank you for all the support. Also, apologies in advance if we're a little light in the joke department this episode, aside from getting to hear me try and pronounce the German words I have to say. Even the darkest humored person such as myself is likely to have a hard time making light of a lot of the material that we're going to cover today, but I will do my devil best. Huh?
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
So firstly, guys, before we get too far into the movie, let's set the scene properly for you. This is a modernized and Americanized version of the actual events that transpired, and so names, places, and such are all a little bit different. For instance, as I alluded to in the intro, the actual woman's name is not Emily Rose. This did not take place in the United States or during whatever time frame this is supposed to be. I'm guessing the early 2000s when this came out. However, despite all of this, once you start digging a little deeper into the real case, you can see who is supposed to be who and where the inspirations that many things in the movie were derived from. I understand these slight changes as they really don't mean anything for producing a scary movie, which is ultimately what they were going for, but for the sake of what we're here to do, you will see later that there may be some clues to take from it. This seems like a good time as well to go over my own source material for this episode if you would like to know more. The first is The Exorcism of Anneliese Michel, written by Dr. Felicitas Goodman, who was an anthropologist known for her expertise in exorcism and the effects of demonic possession on a cultural level. This was originally published in 1981, not long after the criminal trial had been complete, and Dr. Goodman drew from her direct contact with the defense attorney and key witnesses to put together a detailed, reliable timeline of events. Also, given the expertise credentials given and all, I have a feeling the character of Dr. Sadira Adani in the movie that the defense calls upon during the trial might have been slightly influenced by her as well. The other main source for this was Lessons Learned, the Anneliese Michel Exorcism by Reverend Bishop John Duffy, who is an ordained priest of nearly 20 years with the Reformed Catholic Church of North America, and also a former paranormal researcher and law enforcement officer. His book not only recounts the events of Anneliese's case, but also a roadmap, so to speak, of how to properly and safely approach the investigation, determination, and deliverance of a demonic possession. It's worth noting as well that Dr. Goodman believed Anneliese to have been possessed, while Father Duffy contests that she was in fact not possessed and she was suffering from a combination of serious illnesses. This provided not only a balanced field of research for me to draw upon, with both sides getting their proverbial day in court, similar to the way the movie was written and presented, it also provided an interesting little switcheroo in what side of the debate the religious and the intellectual/medical community normally fall on. I also took some time to watch the German film Requiem that's based off of Annalise's story as well, and came out a year after its American predecessor. And it's a solid movie as well that tells this story from a bit of a different and much less pro-Christian perspective. You'll see some clips from that as well, especially during part 1 of this, because it focuses on everything leading up to the trial. Anyway, guys, normally I would begin where our movie does, but we're going to do things a little differently this time, partly because the movie's very much non-linear timeline jumps around a lot through flashbacks and whatnot, making it coherently
Much more difficult!
but also because to truly understand the events of what happened, we need to examine a couple of events prior to the movie's timeline and some things it doesn't expound upon at all. Klingenberg is a small hillside town on the banks of the Main River in the German state of Bavaria that feels like it has changed very little about its identity over the centuries. It is known the world over for the red wine its vineyards produce, all the way back to its days as a Roman frontier settlement when the locals first learned the art of winemaking. Its inhabitants have always been a stoic, industrious, frugal, middle-class folk who, also dating back to the Roman influence, have also always been very predominantly made up of God-fearing Catholics. Joseph Michael and Anna Ferg were no different, and both were brought up in that same humble manner during Germany's economic collapse post-World War I. Both were raised in strict Catholic households, and Joseph's mother had actually pushed heavily for him to pursue becoming a priest when he was young. At age 10, he went off to school to achieve this and excelled at everything with the exception of one subject: Latin, one of the more important skills needed for an aspiring priest. Because of this, Joseph transferred to a trade school and then came back home again to begin the process of eventually taking over the family business. Both Joseph and Anna's fathers each owned Bavarian sawmills, and Anna also worked at her family's business in the office like many girls of her standing did at that time. Joseph would be drafted into the army at the onset of World War II in 1939, aged just 22 years old, and after a brief stint in Belgium and France, would be stationed on the bloody Eastern Front in Russia. After barely surviving this experience and fighting his way back westward, he surrendered to the Americans as their prisoner of war towards the end of the war and was released in June of 1945. He returned home to reassume his role in taking over the sawmill, and he and Anna began their courtship as well, eventually leading to Anna giving birth to their first daughter, Martha, in 1948. This was scandalous business, though, back at this time, as Martha was born out of wedlock, and the extreme disgrace this brought carried all the way till their wedding day 2 years later in 1950, when Anna was forced to wear a black veil.
Can you wear a white wedding dress, young lady?
The way this played tug-of-war with her extreme devoutness and the repentance from it would become defining for her, as she would fervently encourage her children to atone for the sins of illegitimacy through strict devotion. None more so, however, than their second daughter, Annalise, who was born September 21st, 1952.
Do you remember?
Annalise has been described as a sickly child, having seemingly little resistance to disease, as she had afflictions with the measles, mumps, and scarlet fever all before the age of 5. But she was also a kind-hearted, empathetic, and deeply sensitive person, and it's these characteristics that caused her, in particular, to feel an overwhelming sense of pressure to perform penance for her mother. She would later do things such as sleep on a bare stone floor to atone for the sins of the drug addicts who slept in similar conditions at the local train station. And this will serve as the first point that we will want to refer back to when we start to try and assemble this puzzle. This sense of existential atonement as her purpose in life was likely turned up to 11, though, with the next defining moment in it. Annalise's older sister Martha tragically died at the age of 8 due to complications arising from surgery to remove a tumor from her kidney. This obviously not only greatly affected Annalise just from an emotional level, but this would also thrust her into the role of the oldest sibling to her 3 younger sisters, Gertrude, Barbara, and Roswitha, and I'm sure ramped up the pressure even more to be a good role model and an example for them. We do see them briefly in the movie, but only one is of particular note in this case, and so we will refer back to that when the time is right. Martha's unfortunate death likely also planted some seeds of slight mistrust in the McKell family's minds when it came to the medical community that will, spoiler alert, come back into play later on. and that we will go ahead and mark as our next point of reference. Joseph was by all accounts a loving father and a husband, and the leader of his household in every way. However, he was in many ways emotionally unavailable and out of touch with his feelings, most certainly suffering from the effects of PTSD like many World War II veterans. But whereas Joseph's emotional presence might have been too little for what his daughters needed, Anna was most certainly in the complete opposite direction and was objectively too much. All of her daughters, including Annalise, have described her as suffocating and overbearing. Anna sheltered and restricted her daughters in nearly every way possible. They were strictly forbidden to interact with boys and were not even allowed over to a female friend's house if she had a brother. They were not allowed to attend special school events that would have had things such as dancing and other devilish practices going on. What could be worn, what could be read, what could be discussed, these were all controlled with an iron fist, and anything outside of what was deemed the acceptable standard was punished harshly, and likely through the use of religious repentance such as prayer.
You said it, man. Nobody fucks with the Jesus.
Anna was known to just loudly pray over her daughters as well when they showed any signs of dissent, which I'm sure made them feel nice and heard. Basically, this was the kid who most of us knew some form of when we were young that wasn't allowed to do anything because of their overbearing parents, but put that on some sort of holy growth hormone, and that's what we're dealing with. Now, while it is going to be very easy to criticize her parents' methods, we have to keep in mind that the time her parents grew up in and the horrific stuff they likely saw through post-World War I and World War II Germany, so I do partially understand their feeling like they had to shield their children from what the world felt like it was coming to. So while I am most certainly going to be doing my fair share of finger pointing before this is over, I feel it important to mention it.
Finger pointing gets us nowhere! Steve!
It is worth noting also that while we're on the topic, Annalise later told one of her therapists that she had been involved in a secret relationship with a boy when she was in her early teens and how in love and happy she had been with him. But we don't know his name or anything else about him. What we can take from that is that maybe Annalise had a little bit of a rebel inside trying to get out, and that she possibly struggled with the same perceived sinful desires that her mother had. And I'm sure like most every girl that has ever been that age. Anyway, despite all of this pressure and overprotectiveness, Annalise was mostly described as a happy child who loved to sing and play the accordion and piano. She was well-behaved, friendly, and generous, which led to her developing many friendships into her teenage years. She was an excellent student who excelled at many subjects, and many in her family suspected she might go on to be a teacher. One thing she was particularly good at as well was foreign language studies, seemingly being able to pick up words with breathtaking speed, including Latin, unlike her father before her. Keep that point in mind for later also. At school, with a little freedom away from her parents' constant watchful eyes, she was finally feeling the ability to start developing some sort of individuality as well. In the movie, it's depicted as though she was in college and living completely away from them at this time on campus, but in reality, she was still living at home with them and took a train to the city of Aschaffenburg to attend classes. Either way, I'm sure it was the most independence that she had ever felt up to at this point in her life. By all accounts, things were going well in Annalise's life, and she was nearing her 16th birthday and heading back for the fall semester of the year 1968. Unfortunately, this year would not be the beginning of the best years of her life as she had hoped, but rather the beginning of a chain reaction of events that would have a more tragic conclusion than Taylor Swift slowly but surely closing her grip around possessing the souls of everything I love dearly in this world. Firstly, my wife and kids, and now she's taking over football. She won't stop until she has it all. Annalise was sitting in class on a crisp late September afternoon when it first happened. One moment she had been talking to her friends, and the next she was coming to from having seemingly just suddenly blacked out. It was a very quick episode, and so her friends thought maybe she had just fallen asleep and teased her about studying too hard. She agreed and didn't think much of it and went about the rest of her day, and everything else was normal. That is, until that night at midnight. Ah! Sorry, I don't know what happened there. Annalise awoke with the feeling of an intense weight sitting on her chest, unable to move and barely able to breathe. She attempted to call out to her sisters, but she felt like her tongue was paralyzed and no sounds came out. She laid there in total fear that she was dying and unable to alert anyone as to what was happening. After about 15 minutes or so, she regained the ability to move her arms and her legs, but she was completely exhausted and terrified of what had just occurred. While this event certainly frightened her and her family, it appeared to just be a one-off as the following months were quiet, and so they didn't think anything further of it. However, about 1 year later, on August 24th, 1969, it happened again, in the exact same manner as before. A brief blackout in the afternoon, and then came the waking up at 12 a.m. with an intense weight on her chest, seemingly not allowing her to move or... Where does she keep coming from? Just be cool. It's all in your head, man. Anyway, for the demonic possession camp, these events are generally seen as the moments that Annalise experienced her first attacks in a malevolent spirit's attempts to possess her. We see a version of this play out in the movie, and it is creepy as all hell. But if you couldn't tell, that's not exactly how it went down. Firstly, like we mentioned before, she was not alone at the creepiest college dorm ever, as she was in her room with her sisters. And she didn't feel the presence of something take over her the way it's shown in the movie. She awoke in this paralyzed condition. Some of you might have already put this together, but Annalise's description of her symptoms are classic signs of what we define today as sleep paralysis.
Sleep paralysis is the feeling of being aware of your surroundings, but unable to move or speak. Often victims feel pressure on their chest or a sense of choking. During these vivid dream-like experiences, you might see scary creatures near you or even lying in your bed. It's common to experience hallucinations, including hearing voices or feeling something touching you.
It's believed this is caused from the unsuitable timing of REM sleep and the sleeper becoming partially conscious during this cycle, leaving them stuck in a state between dreaming and waking. But studies on sleep paralysis weren't really common or widely available until the 1990s. However, this absolutely terrifying affliction has existed throughout hundreds of years of human folklore. Oh, no. Let's move on before she thinks I'm trying to summon her. For instance, let's take a look at these physicians' notes from a Dutch doctor all the way back in 1664. They are believed to likely be one of the first clinical descriptions of the ailment. In the nighttime, when she was composing herself to sleep, sometimes she believed the devil lay upon her and held her down. Sometimes that she was choked by a great dog or thief lying upon her breast, so that she could hardly speak or breathe. And when she endeavored to throw off the burthen, she was not able to stir her members. And while she was in that strife, sometimes with great difficulty, she awoke of herself. Sometimes her husband hearing her make a doleful, inarticulate voice. For centuries and even millennia, this was something that many cultures attributed to as a malevolent being attempting to invade and take over the human spirit. And this goes all the way back to the character of Lilith from Mesopotamian and Judaic mythology. Many versions exist throughout history, but Lilith is theorized to have been the first wife of Adam, and that she was banished from the Garden of Eden for not obeying and complying with him, believing them to be equals having been created at the same time, making her, I think, the first feminist in existence. She is also thought to have had intercourse with Samael, an angel of death or demon, and then becomes a primordial she-demon or succubus that was known to prey during the nighttime on women during childbirth. Which I found kind of funny that the first recorded marriage in human history ended in divorce, with the woman sleeping with the enemy of her ex and the man slut-shaming her for it. Some things never change. To make things even stranger, one of those aforementioned studies on sleep paralysis from the 90s we mentioned earlier delved into the sudden mysterious deaths of previously healthy men while sleeping and found a disturbing trend. The ethnic group known as the Hmong that come from Laos have a rate of men dying at nearly 2 to 4 times larger than the others studied, and the only link still to this day that has been able to be found is a belief in the spirit known as the Dab Sog, which is described as a crushing nightmare spirit which sits on the chest of its victims and steals their breaths. This would suggest a disturbing notion that the more you believe in these sorts of things, the more susceptible you are to their attacks.
Demons exist, whether you believe in them or not.
Don't be so sure, Father. We may be onto something here, but let's put a pin in that for now. After the second incident, Annalise's mother took her to see their regular physician, Dr. Vaught, and he referred them to a neurologist by the name of Dr. Siegfried Luthi that very same night. He He ran a series of tests, but all of them came back normal both neurologically and psychologically. A couple of days later, on August 27, 1969, he ran an EEG scan which measures the brain's electrical activity and can diagnose many different mental conditions. His findings were, as he quoted in his later testimony, "The EEG recorded on August 27, 1969 showed a normal physiological alpha-type brain activity. I judged from the description I was given that this was probably a case of cerebral seizures of the nocturnal type, with the symptoms of a grand mal epilepsy. Judging from the description, this was probably a cerebral disease of the convulsive kind." What we also know now with the increased research is that sleep paralysis and focal epileptic seizures often mimic one another. However, at this point, Dr. Luthi did not prescribe medication as he thought it too soon to do so with only 2 occurrences a year apart, and advised continued observation for the time being. If it wasn't bad enough that Annalise was grappling with a terrifying medical condition, her mother did nothing to help matters by her constant stressing of keeping everything that had just happened as quiet as possible, as she feared everyone would think the McKell's girl is crazy. She's seeing nerve doctors now. And in a small town, it's easy to develop a big reputation. Okay. I think I'm gonna need some help with this one. Look, I know I said some mean things about you in previous videos, but I need your help. Can you do the thing?
Yo, Taylor, I'm really happy for you. I'm gonna let you finish, but Beyonce had one of the best videos of all time.
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
Okay, guys, I think that should keep her away, at least for now, while she concocts a clever, multi-layered, and Easter egg-filled comeback. Over the next several months, Annalise's health took a turn for the worse. She was diagnosed with both heart and circulation issues and had bouts of tonsillitis, pneumonia, and tuberculosis, the latter of which landed her a stay in a sanatorium starting in February of 1970. It was here where she suffered her 3rd sleep paralysis episode on June 3, 1970, awakening with a blood-curdling scream. The nurses could not determine anything to be wrong, and this episode made her the target of the ire of other patients around her who began teasing her that she was possessed by the devil. It likely was exacerbated by what happened a few days later, when some of the other girls observed Annalise praying the rosary and noted that her hands were contorted like a cat's paws and that her pupils were dilated so that her eyes nearly seemed all black. During this rough time, Annalise really leaned on her faith to get her through it, praying multiple times a day, and reported having one experience while saying the rosary where she felt extreme euphoria and smelled a sweet odor around her similar to violets, believing that she had been visited by the Virgin Mary. On June 16th, Annalise was examined by another neurologist, Dr. Van Haler, in Kempton. He recorded an EEG showing an irregular alpha pattern with some theta and delta waves, but nothing pathological. He was unable to induce any seizures by stimulation at any locus of the brain. Nonetheless, due to her previous seizure episodes, he prescribed anticonvulsant drugs. Annalise was desperate to again feel what she had interpreted as the Virgin Mary's touch from before, and so she continuously prayed in hopes to feel it, but possibly due to the drugs she was on, she was never able to get it to return. However, about a week later, while praying, Annalise suddenly saw a huge grimacing face for a brief moment. From that point onward, she often feared to pray the rosary, thinking that the terrifying face might return. This was her first inkling that her ailments might be something other than an ordinary illness, though the possibility of demonic possession had not yet crossed her mind from what we can tell. It's important to note, too, that this grimacing face did not appear until shortly after she was put on anticonvulsant drugs. Dr. Van Haler's record was not included with the police investigation, and so it's not known precisely which drug she was on at the time. However, after another negative EEG on August 11th, she was dismissed a couple of weeks later on August 29th. There was a noticeable change in her behavior, though, from all of those around her. She seemed distant, moody, prone to anger outbursts that were getting more and more violent over time, and she was still claiming to see demonic faces while praying. She had returned to school, but was now a year behind her friends and struggling to connect with them, and when she did try and confide in any of them about what she was experiencing, they showed little ability to empathize, as they were more concerned with normal teenage girl stuff. This caused Annalise to spiral down even further into depression. The sanatorium recommended a follow-up examination about a month after her discharge, and so she was brought to see a lung specialist named Dr. Reichelt on October 6th. By then, she had experienced another seizure, and so Dr. Reichelt referred her to another doctor, Dr. Packhauser, to examine her circulation problems. Dr. Packhauser believed her seizures to be a cause for concern, but this was outside of his area of expertise, and so it was determined that she should go back and see Dr. Luthi. One big circle.
Shit.
During the next 2 years, Annalise often missed school due to being ill and felt lethargic and apathetic, and this led to her spending more and more time back around her overbearing and strict parents. But she experienced no more seizures until June of 1972, though she was not taking any anticonvulsants for most of this period. Dr. Luthi examined Annalise and could find nothing pathological in her EEG. It was at this point that he prescribed the anticonvulsant Zentropil, which is called Dilantin in the United States, and he recommended regular follow-up appointments. Although the anticonvulsant treatment generally succeeded in suppressing her seizures, she was still frequently seeing demonic faces, but it had progressed to seeing them not only when she was praying now. She was having episodes of locking up rigidly and seeming angry with a distorted face. Starting in October of 1972, she also began to smell an awful stench that she described as burning fecal matter.
What is that? It smells like a turd covered in burnt hair.
The locking up rigidly could be attributed to her medicine, as prolonged muscle contractions, or dystonia, is a known side effect of Dilantin, but the drug is not known to cause hallucinations. In the spring of 1973, Annalise began to hear knocking sounds in her room late at night. These sometimes came from the closet, sometimes from the floor, and sometimes from the ceiling. Her hearing was then tested, but it was determined to be normal. And at this point, Annalise was becoming understandably frustrated with the medical community, as no one seemed to have any answers for her, except referring her to someone else or putting her on an anticonvulsive, which did not seem to be helping with the seizures and hallucinations. It was around this time she started to show the first signs of distress around religious objects, claiming she was unable to pray or attend church as it hurt to try to cross the thresholds to enter it. Despite Anna's best efforts to keep things quiet about her daughter's condition, people were beginning to notice all of the doctor's visits and strange behavior, and word was getting around. Anna really did not like the idea of admitting that her daughter might have some sort of mental illness going on, and so when neighbors started to raise the idea that Annalise might be possessed by something supernatural, she liked that explanation a whole lot better. And it appears to be her that first was the one to really run with the demonic possession theory. And Annalise began to accept this as an explanation around this time too, becoming convinced that something bigger was at work and she was being made to suffer for other sins. Despite her illnesses and the lethargy she attributed to the anticonvulsant drugs, Annalise was able to pass her difficult examinations and graduate in 1973. That summer, her father Joseph organized a trip to San Damiano, which is a very sacred holy site in the Catholic religion located in Italy. Once there, she found that she could not enter the shrine, feeling the ground burn like fire beneath her feet. The praying pilgrims also seemed to be gnashing their teeth at her, and she could not drink from the well, the water of which was reputed to be miraculous. A sacred medal that her father had given her now felt like a crushing weight on her chest if she tried and wear it. Revulsion towards religious items is a classic sign of possession, and she described her behavior as involuntary, or more precisely, "My will is not my own. Someone else is manipulating me." Now seems like a good time to address another potential clue in all of this that we have not discussed yet: the release of the novel The Exorcist in 1971, and the movie based off of it released in 1973, which had its release in Germany in 1974, all around the time this stuff was happening. If you haven't seen the movie, the story is essentially very similar to Annalise's. A girl begins to exhibit what are determined to be signs of a demonic possession after the medical community was unable to help her, and so they enlist the help of a priest to perform an exorcism. Annalise was a well-read young lady, and she had most certainly at least read the novel, if not seen the movie, as this was not your average scary movie release we know today. The Exorcist was a worldwide smash hit and phenomenon, becoming the first horror film to ever be nominated for Best Picture at the Oscars, receiving 10 nominations in all and actually winning 2 of them. It's an interesting question as to whether or not Annalise may have attributed these similar events in the novel as happening to her in real life, and then manifesting it into her hallucinations that she was going to have anyway, but that her religious predispositions just filled in the blanks for her on. We will likely never know this for sure, but it's definitely something to take note of. On September 3rd, 1973, Annalise visited Dr. Luthi again, and finally told him of the hideous faces she had been seeing. She even confided that there was a devil in her, and that a judgment of fire would come upon everyone. Dr. Luthi recalled, "She could not get her mind off of these things. She had no power of decision, and everything was empty in her. She seemed obsessed with the idea of Satan being inside her. Anna McKell claimed that Dr. Luthi advised them to see a priest about the demonic faces, but he vehemently denied that he had done so. Annalise never saw Dr. Luthi again, as she felt he dismissed her experiences and did not prescribe anything beyond another drug that dulls the brain and creates a state of apathy, and Annalise never again confided her demonic visions to any doctor. It was at this time Anna and Annalise began seeking out the help of the church, as they believed this to be something bigger than just a medical ailment. Annalise was clear about her fear of being admitted to a mental hospital and subjected to things like electroshock therapy, and kept reiterating that she was not mentally ill.
That's the thing about crazy people. They don't know they're crazy. That's what makes them crazy.
They first tried Father Habiger, who was a pastor of the Mother of God parish in Aschaffenburg, but he examined Annalise and found only a normal shy girl with no signs of possession. He recommended that she see a physician, and she understandably refused to see any other specialists. Next came Father Rodwick, who was an expert in possession and had become aware of Annalise's case through the San Damiano incident. And while he believed possession to be a possibility, he was in his late 70s and out of the demon-fighting game. Instead, he recommended the retired Father Herman of the Mother of God parish. Father Herman met with Annalise 10 times in his home and found her to be a nice, deeply religious girl. Father Herman did not observe any sacrilegious behavior by Annalise. In fact, she calmly prayed the rosary with him many times without any incident. He recommended that she see a neurologist, but she protested that she had already seen Dr. Luthi, who could not help her. So, in September of 1973, Father Herman visited Father Ernst Alt of the St. Agatha parish in Aschaffenburg. This is who our character of Father Moore is mostly based off of. I say mostly because he is actually an amalgamation of him and one other person we will get to shortly, but from what I can tell, they just didn't want to have two main priest characters, so they lumped both guys into one. But for all intents and purposes, he is more so meant to be based off of Father Alt, in my opinion. Father Alt had already heard about Annalise's case and had long had a deep interest in the paranormal. It's not crazy to assume that he had seen The Exorcist as well. Father Alt also believed himself to have powers of telepathy and precognition. He claimed to suddenly, without warning or knowledge of how, know every single thing about Annalise and the McKell family. He claimed to have experienced the same sorts of weird things happening shortly after hearing about it, such as the bad smells and the knocking coming from out of nowhere. This is echoed in Father Moore's testimony in the movie.
I woke up, freezing. It was exactly 3 a.m. 3 a.m. is the demonic witching hour. Only later did I connect it, and I remembered that same smell of something burning had been perceived by Emily.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and...
During all of this, Annalise was still attending college in Würzburg in the fall of 1973, and continued to take her prescribed medications dutifully, though she continued to still see the hideous faces, and was troubled by homesickness. In November, she met a nice young man named Peter at a dance, but his name is Jason in the movie, and they fell into a deep infatuation with one another. And I just have to say that after what comes next, the fact that Peter stuck by her through this whole thing, I mean, give that man a gold star, because he sees some shit most dudes would run from.
Lover.
I'm gonna have to call in a specialist to keep her away. I hate to do this, but I have no other choice.
In walks 16 of the hottest groupies I've ever seen before, wearing nothing but kimonos and body glitter. I mean, we're doing zippers and zoomers, jalapeno poppers, you name it. Suddenly, one of the twins starts yelling at me, "Oh my God, your eyes are bleeding." So they rushed me to the hospital, where I was legally dead for 17 minutes. Finally, they shocked me back to life. I say, "Thanks, Doc. Now I've got a few ladies to entertain." So 11 orgasms later, 2.5 of them mine. The next thing you know, I'm naked and on fire, running through the lobby of the Chateau Marmont.
Anyway, guys, it was Peter who convinced her to finally see another doctor, this time Dr. Lenner, a psychiatrist. She reported that she felt listless and drained as soon as she awoke each morning and had difficulty concentrating or focusing her will. "I have no willpower. I simply float around and don't know what I want." Dr. Leonard deduced that Annalise had a neurosis stemming from her father's failure to understand her and from her deep-seated hatred of her mother, who forbade her from having boyfriends. Dr. Leonard recommended a neurological examination, and an EEG during sleep was performed the following day, November 28th. And this would be examined by another doctor, Dr. Irmgard Schlepp. For the first time, Annalise's EEG was judged abnormal, as Dr. Schlepp found epileptic patterns referring to a discharge in the left temporal region. She believed that the stenches perceived by Annalise were also products of epileptic activity. Dr. Schlepp changed Annalise's medication from Dilantin to the stronger Tegretol in hopes of finally suppressing these epileptic symptoms. Tegretol is the stand-in for the drug Gambutrol that they mention in the movie, as that is not a real thing, but the side effects of Tegretol include things such as headaches, nausea, fatigue, and lethargy. Ultimately, it did not seem to stop the horrific hallucinations, and when Annalise met with Dr. Schlepp one more time and complained of barely being able to get out of bed, she was instructed to just keep taking the Tegretol, and it eventually reportedly did begin to make Annalise feel better towards the end of '73 and into 1974. At this time, Annalise begins to start having face-to-face meetings with Father Alt, where he gave his priestly blessing and prayed with her. He noticed she improved considerably within 20 minutes as her pupils ceased dilating, and she finally said that she felt all right. Encouraged by this positive response, Father Alt asked the bishop, Joseph Stengel, for permission to conduct the full rite of exorcism when Annalise experienced her next crisis. He did not yet maintain that she was possessed, but that she suffered from circumcessio, a much milder condition than possession where a person is surrounded by evil forces. The bishop instructed Father Alt to continue observing the case, but denied permission to conduct the full rite of exorcism at this time. It was around this time that Annalise's behavior really starts to go off the rails. Despite the recent positive signs, her condition soon turned for the worse, and she became too depressed to study or work on her thesis, and she considered dropping out of school. She became withdrawn from nearly everyone, and for the first time, her exhaustion prevented her from even getting up to eat, so she became visibly thinner. She threw a rosary and a bottle of holy water. She destroyed crucifixes and pictures of Jesus and the Virgin Mary. Her fits of anger became bouts of violent rage as she frequently kicked and tried to bite her sisters and Peter. During these fits of rage, she wouldn't sleep at all. She would run screaming through the house and do odd things such as what we see in the movie, where she begins kneeling down violently on the floor and then standing straight back up and repeating this for hours. She ate spiders, licked her own urine off the floor. She was losing all touch with reality and beginning to behave as different personalities, and at times her face would sometimes contort into a hideous demonic expression. When Father Alt visited her on July 1st, she told him repeatedly that she was damned forever, and his Hail Marys that seemed to help before only agitated her into a tearful screaming fit. She became angry when he reached in his pocket for his crucifix, determining this to be another telltale sign of demonic presence, the knowledge of the unknowable. Though I don't know how much of a stretch it is to know that a holy man may be reaching for a holy object in his pocket, but anyway, this was more than enough to convince Father Alt that Annalise was possessed, and he sought out permission from his bishop, Joseph Stengel, to begin doing prayers of exorcism over her. After Anna and Joseph petitioned for this as well, an oral permission was given to say only the short German form of the exorcism rite. This was carried out on August 3rd, 1975, and despite some pleas from Annalise to stop because it was burning in her back and her arms, Father Alt noted that it did seem to help the situation. However, her behavior only worsened throughout August, and after this first set of prayers, she began to show the more classic signs of demonic possession, like superhuman strength despite the fact that she was frail from hardly eating at this point. They again contacted Father Rodwick in Frankfurt, and at this point he had to come see the girl for himself. Father Rodwick saw Annalise laying on the floor in an apparent hypnotic trance, oblivious to those around her. She was helped up, and the priest asked her, "What is your name?" The response was, "Judas," uttered in a deeper, altered voice. This clear manifestation of a second personality that named itself persuaded Father Rodwick that this was a true case of possession. Ultimately, it would be determined that Annalise had 6 different spirits claiming to possess her: Judas, Cain, Nero, Hitler, Fleischmann, and Lucifer. In the movie, they sub out Hitler and Fleischmann for a couple of more generic demon names, but there is actually some clues to be taken from all of this. It seems strange to most that with the exception of Lucifer, all of these supposed demons were actually the spirits of traditionally evil men, and this is because demons are known to be malevolent spirits that are not human in nature. Father Rudwick claimed that the name Judas was often given by other possession victims, however, and it is not that the demon was actually the Judas of the Gospels, but rather the name represents the role or the function of the demon. A Judas demon attempts to force its victim to imitate the apostle in the betrayal of his Lord. She displayed things such as a compulsion to kiss people while wearing a hostile expression on her face, reminiscent of the Judas kiss. Father Roderick found these behaviors confirmed his suspicion that she was indeed possessed by a Judas demon. The fact that 5 of the 6 of them were people rather than classical demons raises some unanswered questions, though still, as does the men that she reported to be possessing her. We covered Judas Iscariot, the man who betrayed Jesus. Cain was one of the children of Adam and Eve, alongside with his brother Abel, whom he murdered. Nero was a Roman emperor from the years 54 to 68, and whose reign is considered to be one of the most sadistic in history. I have to say that I'd contest Caligula might be the more evil of the two, but Nero's crimes were targeted in great part against Christians, making him more evil in the eyes of the ultra-religious. Hitler is a pretty obvious one given his history and the fact that the Nazi Party really has its roots in Bavaria, where the Mikkels called home. And then there is Valentin Fleischmann, and he's a bit of an interesting one, as he was a German Catholic priest in the 1570s who was excommunicated and charged for murder. He's the clear outlier of the group, and it's believed that Anneliese studied Fleischmann, and this explains his presence as the sixth spirit named. As I mentioned before, Anneliese was an avid reader of both religious work and others, and so she most certainly would have been well versed on knowledge of Cain, Judas, Nero, Hitler, and obviously Lucifer. These really read as a sort of all-star list of who Anneliese personally probably thought of as the worst of the worst, and this is why these names were given by her. In any event, going off the basis of the reports of Father Rodwick and Father Alt, the bishop finally granted permission on September 16, 1975, to conduct the full rite of exorcism, and it was to be carried out 8 days later on the 24th. We're going to get more into the practice and processes of an exorcism a bit later, but broadly speaking, they follow the same pattern. The ritual involves a fixed sequence of prescribed prayers, followed by direct questioning of the demons, and culminates in direct commands for them to leave the possessed. This permission was given to Father Arnold Renz, superior of a Salvatorian monastery and pastor of a parish near Klingenberg. He's the other guy Father Moore is based off of, and was reputed to be a pious and intelligent man, kind and trustworthy. When Father Renz first met Anneliese, he did not perceive her to be showing any signs of being possessed, and referred to her as being quite normal. This was until he began sprinkling her with holy water, and she reacted incredibly violently, thrashing around and yelling, "Put away that shit." She had to be physically restrained and attempted to attack anyone close to her. She growled and hissed and let out horrific screams. All of this would have been done in Latin, which remember she was incredibly fluent in. She would describe this first exorcism as being like a spectator, watching it unfold but having no control over her words or actions, as the demons had full control over her at this point. In the movie, it's said only one exorcism was performed, but this isn't true, as she actually underwent several of them over the course of the coming months. The one we see in the movie on Halloween was an especially notable one, as in real life, Anneliese claimed to have been visited by the Savior, and he had told her that the demons had been ordered to leave by Halloween, and so accordingly, everyone expected that this would be it. The scene in the movie is incredibly creepy, and Jennifer Carpenter does a fantastic job of selling this, but in real life, this event was even scarier. I'm going to place some of the real tapes of the recorded exorcisms and also put some of the transcript up on screen. I understand if this is disturbing to some folks, so I'm going to put a scary face on the corner here. Consider that your warning, and you can skip ahead until it's gone.
Ich hab recht dazu, dass ich in dem Wald rein bin. Ich trag dir die Rotznase noch so lang, bis es lebt wird. Ist saublöde Weib. Für uns geht's kein Zurück. Nee! In alle Ewigkeit!
Alright! God, you were normal yesterday.
This exorcism on Halloween was an especially long and brutal one, but at 10 o'clock, each of the demons depart, though with much verbal resistance and screaming, saying Hail Mary, full of grace, as commanded by the priest upon exiting. Each of these evil human spirits admit their crimes in life, and Lucifer is the last one to depart, with all of the demons gone by 10:40. The success of this exorcism is short-lived, however, as the priest and family start to sing a Marian hymn, and a demonic growl and scream interrupts them, saying, "I have not gone out yet." Father Renz continues for 3 more hours to try to cast him out, but without success. On a November 9th exorcism session, the demon again identifies as Judas, saying that he and 4 others returned shortly after being expelled with the lady's permission. During another session, something interesting is said by Annalise when Lucifer is the one claiming to be in control. She says, "The snot-nosed brat is cursed. She belongs to us now. She is no longer alive." Father Alt asks, "Is she down there with you?" To which she says, "No, I have to say everything, so therefore the snot-nose has to pay for it." Father Alt says, "You have to get out of her," to which she responds, "I don't want out yet, because I have so much to say." This is interesting because snot-nose was what everyone called Annalise when she was back at the sanatorium when she was 17. Was this possibly just repressed emotions from a horrible period in her life manifesting itself in these demons? For the rest of the year, Annalise continued basically leading something of a double life and continued taking Tegretol. She rarely manifested demonic behavior outside of these exorcism sessions at her family's house, and continued her studies at Wurzburg, with most of her school companions being completely unaware of her state of possession. The exorcism sessions in January were a lot shorter, and the demon was more subdued, even seeming disinterested in participating at times. In another session on February 1st, Annalise told Father Renz that she had recently begun to experience compulsions, such as she was no longer permitted to eat or cover herself from the cold. She felt that her prayers were unheard and that her suffering for the sake of others was far more difficult than she expected. By the last week of April, Annalise had again started completely refusing food, and some of her friends suggested that she call a doctor, but she would not have any of this. None of these friends were aware of her possession or exorcisms, keep in mind. The only doctor that got to see Annalise in this state was Dr. Richard Roth, a friend of Father Alt who visited her on May the 30th. And we see him in the movie as well, however, he did not mysteriously die right before the trial. In fact, he would later testify, but we'll get into that later on. Meanwhile, the exorcisms were consistently becoming more and more unsuccessful in getting the demons to speak, and Annalise began causing harm to herself, slamming her head into walls, rubbing her face violently against them. She tried to bite into the walls and broke a bunch of her teeth. She even smashed her head through a window at one point. She still compulsively knelt and rose as hard as she could, and eventually caused massive injuries to both of her knees. She screamed and she raged in bed, even as her mother attempted impromptu exorcism prayers. When she wasn't in these fits of rage, Annalise maintained that she was not crazy and that she was still receiving visits from the Savior, who assured her that this would all be over by July of that year. The last exorcism that would be performed was on June the 30th of 1976. Annalise had a fever and was clearly wasting away from the continued lack of eating. She had bruises on both of her eyes and all over her body from the continued self-harm. She was just in awful condition overall. Nothing of particular note happened at this final exorcism, but it's reported that her last words to Father Renz were, "Please, absolution," requesting the absolution part of the rite, which he then gave. When it was finished, Peter and Father Renz left, and her parents remained with Annalise. Anna went to bed a short while afterward, but it wasn't long before Annalise started screaming and throwing herself around again. Her father was still in the same room, and as it was past midnight, he told her that he commanded the demons to leave in the name of the Father, since it was now July, and they were obligated to depart so that she could recover. After that, she turned quietly on her right side and went to sleep. She would never wake up again, and died at the young age of 23, ultimately eerily ridding herself of the demons by July, just as she had predicted. That brings us back around to the beginning of the movie, where it is now the morning after Annalise/Emily's death, and the medical examiner is conducting his investigation, after which he concludes that he cannot determine the cause of death to be natural. Now, in real life, Annalise's father, Joseph, was apparently extremely quick and insistent on getting the examiner out there to determine a natural death, and the details are described as such in this letter from the prosecutor, Carl Stenger. Today at 1:30, I had a telephone call from a Father Alt. He did not give his address. He described a case of exorcism, driving out of devils, to me, which he said that he had carried out on a young girl, Annalise Michel of Klingenberg. He described previous treatments that the girl had undergone, all without success, by psychiatrists and neurologists in Aschaffenburg, specifically Dr. Siegfried Luthi, and in Würzburg. He described the symptoms that she had been suffering from and the successes and failures of the exorcism. He mentioned that during periods of arousal, she was at times unable to eat or drink, and that this had also happened recently. Everyone had hoped, however, that she would soon start taking nourishment again. Finally, he mentioned that the girl had died this morning. When I called the courthouse in Klingenberg at about 3, the clerk told me that Joseph Mikkel, the dead girl's father, had come to the office there at about 1 o'clock and had applied for a death certificate for his daughter. He said that she had suddenly developed a very high fever and had quite unexpectedly died this morning. When he was informed that only a physician could issue such a certificate after properly having viewed the body, he said that there was a physician at his house right now. The clerk called his home and spoke to a Dr. Roth. Whether this person was indeed a physician is not known. Dr. Ross said that he did not have the requisite forms. He did not carry out any post-mortem examination. Burial is to be Saturday morning. Upon calling the general practitioner in Klingenberg, Dr. Martin Kahler, I was informed that the latter had found at his post-mortem that the corpse was totally emaciated and still warm. It exhibited a number of skin abrasions. He did not issue the death certificate because he could not attest to a natural cause of death. He suggested that an autopsy be carried out. He also told me that he had last seen the girl in a good nutritional state in October 1975. 2 months ago, her father had called him and asked him to come and make a house call. A little later, however, he canceled it. In any event, as that letter just stated, due to the condition Annalise was in, there was absolutely no chance of getting a natural death certification, and when the autopsy was performed, it revealed that she had died of starvation and dehydration, possibly exacerbated from physical exertion, but all of her internal organs, including the brain, were deemed to be normal. This story gained notoriety very quickly in the German public. We already went over how big of a deal the Exorcist release was, but also weirdly out of coincidence, this case happened at the same time as a spirited public debate over the exact same topic. A well-known theology professor had published a thesis delving into the question of the devil being only a concept and a symbolic representation of evil, or was there an actual existence of evil forces? Annalise's death being a literal set piece in this argument brought it a great increase in attention. And if that wasn't bad enough, Dr. Goodman writes in her book that shortly into this whole thing, a person from the nearby town of Bretzingen had called up the authorities investigating this case and told them that a Catholic priest of their village had been playing tapes over the loudspeaker of their local tavern. These tapes were suspected to be of the exorcisms, and their very scary contents had the locals in a near panic, so the DA confiscated them as probable evidence in their case. However, the stories had already begun spreading, and the imaginations of the people were running wild since very little was known about actual exorcisms at this time, seeing as they were only very rarely approved by the church and even less so publicly spoken about. After a year-long intensive criminal investigation, the two priests, Anna and Joseph, were all charged with negligent homicide on July 13, 1977. One obvious huge change in the movie is that only the character of Father Moore is put on trial, and Anna and Joseph only act as witnesses. I'm not entirely sure why they made that change, but in real life, Annalise's parents were also being accused of the same charges. In fact, one thing they did prior to the beginning of the trial was to petition to have Annalise's body exhumed, with the thinking that if she had been demonically possessed, that her body would not have decayed at all since her burial, and it would serve as exonerating proof. In a somewhat surprising move, permission was granted to dig her up, but the police would not let Anna and Joseph view their daughter's body, only reporting to them that it had decayed as expected, with nothing out of the ordinary. It's also worth noting that Joseph Stengel, the bishop who, remember, approved all of the exorcisms, was also investigated but was ultimately not charged. His name was dragged through the mud anyway, though, in the papers, and this caused him to step down from his position. Shortly after this, he suffered a stroke brought on by the grief caused from it and lost his power of speech for the short remainder of his life, dying soon after the dust was settled. The criminal trial officially began on March 13, 1978, and brought on another media storm with many in the public raging that the Catholic Church had seemingly overruled modern science and conducted secret exorcisms resulting in the death of a poor young woman. Headlines in newspapers reported on Bavaria as "the land where demons howl." By this point, it had received so much attention that it would be described as the biggest criminal trial in Germany's history, save for the Nuremberg trials. Speaking of that, Anna and Joseph's lawyer would be Erich Schmidt-Leichner, who was a renowned legal name, having defended numerous names during the Nazi war crime trial. Father Renz and Father Alt were also both appointed top lawyers by the church, and our main lawyer character in the movie of Aaron Brunner appears to have been possibly slightly influenced by Frau Marianne Thora, who defended Father Alt in real life. She served as a primary source of information for Dr. Goodman's book, but I couldn't find much about her personally beyond that. The character in the movie serves as the vessel to show a skeptic being convinced to believe this to be a real case of demonic possession. She mentions at one point as being agnostic, and by the end she is obviously a believer, having been also seemingly visited as well by malevolent forces. The prosecution's attorney, on the other hand, played amazingly by Campbell Scott, serves as the movie's vessel of a very religious person who is hard in the camp of this all being a medical issue and thus finding the defendants culpable. And you'll see later that it's not quite as exaggerated as it is in the movie, but he goes hard.
But we'll just have to take you at your word on those, won't we? You're really God's gunslinger, aren't you, Father? Standing tall and facing down the devil with your prayer book at your side. Where is your dark figure, Father? Is he here now? Do I look like your demon ghost?
Like I mentioned in the intro, this is basically the movie's way of presenting both sides of the coin to you, the audience, to decide for yourselves what you think happened. And as a fun fact, this was done this way because director/writer Scott Derrickson sees himself as a believer of the possession explanation, and the other writer, Paul Harris Boardman, is in the skeptic camp. Anyway, what is very authentic to what happened in real life is the distance that the church tried to put itself from this case beyond the appointing of lawyers. Incredibly taken aback by the majority of the people's reception of this case, they provided no assistance to investigators, no public support, and basically left Father Renz and Father Alt holding their Bibles and praying for an acquittal. From what I can tell, however, there was no reluctance to go with the possession theory from the defense or to put the fathers on the stand to testify, as Father Alt actually went first and leaned all the way into the explanation that Annalise was possessed and that her not eating was 100% attributed to the influence of the demons. He maintained that there was nothing that the medical community could have done to help her, and that this was why they did not seek any further assistance from doctors. He also fervently repeated that Annalise did not want to be seen by any other doctors, and that it was her choice to put herself in God's hands. Father Renz also theorized this to be a penance possession, where the possessed endures suffering in reparation of someone else's sins, yet he admitted he could not understand the meaning of this penance. One thing they were not able to do, however, is play the tapes of the exorcisms in the courtroom like we see in the movie, and enter it in as admissible evidence, which seems a bit weird if you ask me. Father Alt's friend Dr. Roth testified as well, like we mentioned earlier, but his testimony was deemed inconsistent and implausible on several points. It's likely that he was just trying to exonerate himself from a charge of criminal negligence, as he would say that he came only out of scientific curiosity, not in his capacity as a physician. According to the McKells, Peter, and the priests, Dr. Roth promised to Father Alt that he would come in case of a medical emergency and suggested treatments for her bruises, but considered her general condition untreatable by a physician, allegedly saying, "There are no injections against the devil." It's also worth noting that Dr. Roth was a fairly eminent physician, published in medical journals, and had no prior attachment to belief in exorcism. On the contrary, his new experience with exorcism led him to start going to church. Annalise's neurologist, Dr. Luthi, would also testify, and this is where he would deny that he told her and Anna that they should seek out the help of an exorcist like we mentioned before. Also, like we said, we would circle back to Annalise's sister Roswitha was called up to give her accounts of what she saw happen. We don't see this in the movie, but it's said that when she was asked why they didn't call a doctor, she replied, "What would you call a doctor for? Possession is not like a broken leg, you know." Peter was also brought up to give his story of the things that he had been witness to over the time of seeing Annalise. One person who did not testify was an anthropologic expert on exorcisms like Dr. Adani, whom we see in the movie, but as I mentioned in the opener, this character is a stand-in for Dr. Goodman, and so I understand her inclusion. Her character's testimony in the movie speculates that Emily was a hypersensitive to altered states of consciousness, making her susceptible to a demonic possession. She posits that the prescribed psychoactive drugs interfered with the therapeutic effect of exorcism since it relies on inducing psychospiritual shock, which is prevented by sedatives. This differs slightly from what Dr. Goodman hypothesized in real life, stating that she believed instead that the drug made the demonic personalities lethargic and subdued, making confrontation impossible. Must have been some good shit. For the prosecution, very much like what we see presented, they leaned heavily into bringing in renowned folks from the medical field to give expert testimony on Annalise's condition, one of whom was Professor Sades, who was a psychiatrist at one of the hospitals Annalise had been to. In his testimony, he contested that the meds had stopped the seizures and that her condition sought another outlet, developing into psychogenic psychosis. His opinion was that she was delusional and psychotic and eventually just completely lost the plot. and that furthermore, had she been placed into medical care rather than having exorcisms performed on her, that she would still be alive. He also said that he would have treated her by having her tranquilized, force-fed, and having electroshock therapy sessions performed against her will, very much like what we see the one witness say in the movie during his cross-exam.
To save her life? Absolutely.
One thing we need to mention here is that German law was, at least at the time, much less libertarian in the right to refuse treatment and the forced medical intervention fields, and some would say wrongfully lean into the idea of the body must survive at all costs. So the medical testimony put forward by the prosecution was very well received, and it could be argued that the evidentiary testimony given by the defense was not even really valued, seeing as it would require one to at least consider the possibility of the supernatural. To put it more bluntly, they never had a chance. It does seem a bit funny and convenient to me, though, that after Annalise was gone and there was no real challenge to their diagnosis, that out come all these folks from the medical field Monday morning quarterbacking and definitively coming up with the exact same conclusion.
Sounds like you have mental problems, man.
Yeah, you have mental problems, man.
Yeah, it really does.
And it sort of begs the question that if they were so sure that this is what this was, why was it never determined while something could have been done about it? I suppose one answer could be that, as it turns out, a detailed psychiatric examination was never performed by any of the doctors that she had seen while she was alive, which one could say is absolutely crazy in itself. The other explanation is that seemingly the medical community was just doing whatever it could to avoid any scrutiny in its role regarding this. Anyway, in real life, this was a judge-only trial. There was no jury like we see in the movie. Also, unlike in the movie, while the DA sought the charge of negligent homicide, they were not seeking the maximum punishment, and actually it was their recommendation that the priests only be fined and Anna and Joseph be let off without punishment, seeing as they had already lost their child. On April 21st, 1978, the judge would give his verdict, finding the four of them all guilty of negligent manslaughter. Ultimately, it was determined that Annalise had epilepsy that grew into a full-blown psychosis, that the exorcisms did aggravate her condition, and that her parents and the priests should have sought medical attention because had they done this, she would still be alive. They were all sentenced to 6 months jail time, but it was commuted down to 3 years of probation. After it was all said and done, Father Renz and Father All essentially faded back into relatively quiet lives of obscurity. Annalise's sisters would all go on to leave home, and while I'm sure they never forgot what they witnessed her go through, they more or less moved on to lead normal lives. Joseph died in 1999, and Anna continued living alone in the same house with a view overlooking Annalise's grave all the way up until she died in 2012. She never saw the movie, and I can't say that I blame her. However, even in her older years, she always maintained that she still fervently believed that her daughter had been possessed by something not of this world, and that she had no regrets because in her heart, she knew that they did the right thing. The McKell family home burned down on June 6, 2013, the cause of which is still debated to this day. However, Annalise's grave site remains a pilgrimage site even to this day. So full disclosure, guys, when I began this, I fully expected to come down hard in the camp of this being a complete case of misdiagnosed mental illnesses and a perfect storm of outside contributors that led to an unfortunate conclusion. And while I still have my doubts about this case specifically, the question of whether or not I believe demonic possession as a whole to be possible is far less cut and dry than I expected it to be. The idea of it was something that frightened me as a church-going and impressionable kid and now fascinates me as a cynical agnostic adult, and my delving into the topic was done with, let's just call it, an uneasy eagerness. My intention was to do a deep dive on this, but I quickly discovered that it was just too massive a topic that I am too unqualified to go on a long dissertation about.
Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it. I award you no points, and may God have mercy on your soul.
However, throughout researching this topic and the numerous opinions out there on it, I want to point you in the direction of the one I found myself being really interested in, and that is the works of Dr. Richard Gallagher. He's a renowned board-certified psychiatrist that teaches out of Columbia University, and he is literally the go-to guy for numerous faith leaders when it comes to evaluating those suspected of a demonic possession and distinguishing the difference between mental illness or a soul under attack. I'm still finishing his book, Demonic Foes, and I would highly recommend it so far, as he tells his own personal journey from skeptic to believer through his experiences and cases. But in my opinion, reading what this guy has to say for even a short amount of time, you know that this isn't some snake oil salesman trying to sell you a bill of goods. He's really not trying to convince you at all, so to speak. His book is his own recounts of what he has seen over the course of his career and his process of investigating and differentiating cases in a field that is full of bullshit artists from both the afflicted and the healer side of things. He explains that the diagnostic process for this is thorough and extensive, and it is intended to produce an absolute moral certainty, as not only do you have to contend with the masquerading mental illnesses, that there are also those out there that are bluntly doing it for attention, and this is where those cases get filtered out. It goes without saying that a quote-unquote true case of possession is exceedingly rare. Dr. Gallagher states that practically speaking, there's no such thing as a typical exorcism because they're all different. The existence and deliverance of evil spirits is something that has existed in an overwhelming number of cultures all throughout our history, and so there are many different rituals and practices, which is yet another reason why it is hard to dismiss the idea completely out of hand, in my opinion. The Catholic exorcism is probably the most well-known and ritualized, but Orthodox Christians also have a fairly set ritual that they say. A typical session goes on for about 45 minutes. Sometimes the demon surfaces, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the person is delivered in one exorcism, but he's seen other exorcisms that go on for extended months or years, and sometimes the deliverance never comes at all. As for what types of demons there are out there, he mentions that some of them appear super silly, while others are much more malevolent in nature. Clearly, you're dealing with different levels of personality, but they don't reveal very much as far as their individual ones. One of the reasons for that is that they don't want to leave, so invariably they lie. They are constantly trying to confuse people, so they may say that they're a dead soul, which could explain the murderer's row of murderers that claim to be inside of Annalise. For any of you panicking about waking up tonight at 3 a.m. in a battle with a demon, unless you're planning to play around with the occult, you needn't fret about that because, in Dr. Gallagher's own words during an Esquire interview, possession is not something that's going to happen willy-nilly to anybody. People don't have to go to bed at night worried that they're going to wake up possessed in the morning. There's a spectrum of attacks, but the people who become possessed are almost invariably, and I'm choosing my words carefully here because there are a few exceptional cases, people who have turned in a serious way to something evil. That could mean serious dabbling or immersion in dark occult areas of behavior like Satanism. That said, you can't go around saying that Satan is everywhere. More people become involved in the serious pursuit of what they regard as magic or witchcraft. Surprisingly, some people who have turned to evil in a serious way will turn to beliefs that we would regard as occult or dark, like cults. They get involved in that and then they expect favors in return, and after a while they find that it was a fool's bargain. They're in over their heads, and occult forces they've committed to have spun out of control, effectively possessing them. It doesn't in any way depend on the particular religious tradition, nor does it depend on a person's belief or disbelief in God. It's not going to happen to your average atheist of goodwill, but if someone has no religious belief and they've turned to evil in some ways, they're in a worse condition because they don't know how to get help. I've met people with completely agnostic or atheistic beliefs who somehow dabbled in the occult, then found themselves way in over their heads. When it comes to the deliverance, the practice itself is meant to be a spiritual shock to the system that some would argue is just the most intense placebo effect that can be attained. Seasoned exorcists claim such things that it is 90% the patient's own efforts and 10% the exorcism. And as Dr. Gallagher puts it, they are only part of the process of liberation. They're not magic. So it appears to harken back to the stronger the belief, the stronger the possible efficacy of the exorcism.
Are you afraid of it?
He adds that the victims of these possessions are suffering in the extreme. I'm a physician, so I try to help suffering people. One can say, I don't believe in that stuff. Okay, so what are these people supposed to do? Just assume that this is all nonsense when they know that it's a real condition they're suffering from? You can't do experiments in this area. I went to medical school. I was taught science and the scientific method. The scientific method of the modern age is built on what we call methodological naturalism. In other words, we don't assume that spiritual forces are operating because you can't study them in the same way. You can't study them empirically. Then you have to decide, is there enough knowledge based on historical evidence? You can't really prove how people crossed the Delaware with George Washington. You have to accept it on the basis of sound testimony. It's the same with exorcisms. You have to look at the testimony. Does it seem reasonable? Is it consistent with other teachings? For instance, teachings of the major faiths, all of which believe in evil spirits. It becomes a question of when to start believing people. 400 of these exorcists at the International Association all have similar stories. I'm sure that there are many Protestant ministers in America who would have seen some weird phenomena, both during exorcisms and outside of exorcisms. You listen to them and then you decide, like anything else.
Are you pulling my dick, bro?
Like I said before, this is just way too intense of a topic to hit all the pertinent info, and so I will once again recommend you to do your own rabbit hole digging if you're interested. But when evaluating Annalise's case, I think it's best to go ahead and use Dr. Gallagher's own methodology, which, as he puts it, I ask one basic question. Do the patient's symptoms have a natural or scientific explanation? Revisiting our points of reference, it obviously paints the picture of an overly repressed, mentally ill girl with predispositions of religious repentance. She not only had little faith in the medical system, however justified she wasn't feeling that way, and she also had an out-and-out fear of being labeled mentally insane and committed due to it. And there is certainly no denying she had neurological issues. She was most definitely suffering from epilepsy and some degree of sleep paralysis. It's also seemingly an easy conclusion to come to these days to point to schizophrenia as a definite explanation. However, schizophrenia is sort of an umbrella term covering any disorder where the patient exhibits hallucinatory experiences, paranoia, social dysfunction, and disruption of cognition or emotion. The list of symptoms defining schizophrenia varies by country, and since they're generally inconsistent, there is a strong reason to doubt that it is really a single disorder anyway, and there is no objective test for it, which makes it all the more of a gray area. Annalise's condition is an imperfect match using the most diagnostic definitions of schizophrenia. She saw demonic faces and heard voices, even not during her epileptic fits, and these hallucinations are consistent with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. But other symptoms of hers are not as easily explainable with that label, such as the tearing off of her clothes, the compulsive and violent genuflections, the eating insects and licking her own urine. She even bit the head off of a bird. These types of behaviors make for a wide range of psychosis, and that could be considered too broad to be contained under one diagnosis of schizophrenia. And so in some minds, the question still remains as to whether these apparent psychotic behaviors had a natural or supernatural cause. And when it ultimately comes to my opinion on that matter, I hate to cop out and say both, but the fact is afflictions of the mind and afflictions of the spirit seemingly walk hand in hand down a fine line together. And there are legitimate unanswered questions as to how certain events of this happened the way that they did. So at the end of the day, while I believe this was overwhelmingly an issue of mental and environmental factors playing their part, I don't think it can be definitively ruled out that there wasn't something possibly going on beyond our comprehension. Whether or not that was demonic forces is ultimately a question that can unfortunately never be answered and may just come down to your own individual beliefs. And to that effect, I will leave you with this blurb from a prominent Christian writer. Demons are happy that we don't believe in them, and they're also happy when we become overly preoccupied with them. Sleep tight, everyone. That's going to do it for this one, guys, and I will be honest, I am happy to be done with this one and out of this headspace. I hope you all enjoyed this, and if you did so, please again do the things to the buttons. Also, let me know what movie you would like a real story on. Maybe I will oblige you in the future.
Oh, would that make you love me?
Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. Ah, fuck! Anyway, what is very authentic to happen in what Jesus fucking Christ. Help me with this one.